von Franz, dreams show us our unlived life through the figure of the shadow. Psychologically, what is the meaning of the word shadow?
That is simply a name we use for the fact that most people are not fully aware of all their personality traits. We like to imagine ourselves as being intelligent or generous or good-natured or practically gifted and whatnot. And there are other qualities of our conscious personality, inferior qualities, which we know somewhere. I mean, the surroundings tell us about them generally, and in quarrels it comes out. But we tend to push it into the shadow. We don't look at it. And when we think about ourselves, we forget about these qualities. Only our best friends and people we live with, our marital partners, can generally very clearly point out these more inferior traits.
I'd like you to interpret a rather amusing shadow dream of a 13-year-old boy.
I dreamt I was a huge eagle, and I was flying over the town, and I saw my friend Chris and Mike. They were walking to school. So I swooped down, and I shit right on top of Chris's head, and he had to go home to wash his hair. And then I was sitting on top of his roof, and he was going back to school at lunch. And so I swooped down, and I shit right on top of his head again. And he went crying inside. And I thought it was the funniest thing I'd ever done.
In this dream, we see again Gilgamesh and Enkidu, so to speak, in another variation. The two boys are friends, but they are also as contrasts. The friend onto whom he shits is more of an extrovert boy who likes collective sports and wants to go out. And the dreamer himself prefers individual plays and seems to be a more reflective character. And in the dream, it begins that he flies, he's an eagle and is flying. An eagle, in general, is, in heraldics, the eagle is always the animal of kings and leaders. And because one thought that, like the lion is the king of the wild animals, the eagle is the king of the birds. So he has something to do with the power drive, but also with spiritual elation, with high flights in thought and fantasy. It looks as if the dreamer has more fantasy, much more fantasy, capacities of fantasy than his extrovert friend. Now, all introvert individualists secretly envy the extrovert because the extrovert is more successful collectively, and generally introverts have a certain feeling of inferiority towards extroverts. Extroverts have them too towards the other, but they never admit it. But the introverts generally admit that they envy the worldly successful friend. And therefore, in the dream, the balance is restored, that our dreamer as an eagle succeeds in shitting on his friend's head, and by that humiliating him. He has to go and get Mama's help, and he has naturally an elated feeling of triumph. One could look at the dream a bit suspiciously and say there's also a little warning in it that he shouldn't elevate himself too much above the friend, but I think it rather means a compensation, that he feels a bit uncertain or inferior towards his friend, and therefore the dream shows him the possibility, look here, you are the real eagle, you can shit on his head, so it's no problem.
Can the shadow also take a positive form?
Because of wanting to play a social role, most people identify more with their positive qualities, and therefore the shadow is generally more awkward, inferior, sometimes a bit evil, or socially unadapted. But that is not always so. There are people who prefer to live their worst side, and then their shadow is positive. There has been made studies among criminals who live, so to speak, the worst side of their personality, and then they have a positive shadow. They have a well-meaning helper of man as a shadow figure. but the normal average is that we identify or prefer to identify more with our positive and developed traits of character, and therefore push more the inferior side into the shadow. The most famous example is Mr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. That is a literary representation where we can really see how man and his shadow live together and act upon each other. Everybody casts a shadow, so to speak, by the very fact that we are, for instance, if we use a lot of intellectual thinking, our feeling will be relatively inferior or undeveloped because we don't give it enough time. Or somebody who works mostly with machines and technical things tends to neglect his fantasy, his passive fantasizing or his artistic gifts. And so the shadow, if we repress the shadow, we are only half people. That's why there are in literature such tales that the devil steals the shadow from people, and then they are, so to speak, in the claws of the devil, because we need a shadow. The shadow is what keeps us down to earth, which reminds us of our incompleteness, and which also provides us with complementations. We would be very poor if we were only what we imagine to be.
Could you give us some examples of where we see the shadow in everyday life?
I would say whenever we are tired or under stress, another personality breaks through. For instance, people who are very well-meaning and helpful suddenly become ruthlessly egocentric, push everybody else aside and become very nasty. Also, for instance, when people have the flu or are ill, suddenly you see their shadow side coming through. Or, for instance, you have people who are always in a good mood and cheerful and enterprising, and one day they become suddenly like ill-tempered bears, and you have a feeling, I've never seen that person that way. There's a sudden change of character. That's the breaking through of the shadow. It can take on 1,000 forms. Or, for instance, you have a very good friend, and he lends you a book, and just that book your friend loses. He wants to nothing, the last thing to do, but his shadow wanted to play you a trick. That happens very often when people are jealous of each other. Then they play to the person of whom they are jealous, they play nasty tricks, they lose their objects, or they don't keep the appointments, and so on. And they have the best of intentions, but their shadow plays a role and does nasty tricks behind their own back. It's well known that, for instance, policemen and criminals have a shadow relationship to each other. Criminals are very good policemen if one makes them into one. And many policemen fight their own shadow in the outer form of criminals and would have a criminal inclination themselves if they weren't policemen. And that is only one example which is well known in criminalistics. And we have all our favorite enemy, our best enemy, so to speak. That is generally our shadow. We have to, if somebody gets on one's nerves without reason, if somebody does some harm to you, then you can't say it's natural that you hate him or her. But if somebody doesn't do special harm to you and you just feel madly irritated every time that person enters the room, you could just spit at them, then you can be sure that's the shadow. The best way then is to sit down and write a little paper on the characteristic of that person and then look at it and say, that's me. I have done that once when I was 18, and I blushed so that I was sweating blue in the face when I had done that. It's a real shock to see one's shadow. Clergymen are very problematic natures, because the community expects them to always be mild and friendly and helpful and virtuous, and the poor man or woman has a shadow too naturally. So then they can't live their shadow, and if they live it, the whole community howls against them, and so they generally spend their relationship to evil by seeing it in other people and preaching against it. Is that too poisonous?
Dr. von Franz, why are we so often chased or threatened in our dreams?
Very often shadow figures pursue us. Burglars or all sorts of enemies pursue us. And in general, one can say that if something in the dream pursues us, it wants to come to us. If only we could, it demonstrates that something which belongs to us and wants to come towards us, but we are afraid of it. And by being afraid, we lend it an evil figure. Could we turn around and accept it? It would probably become more benevolent. Naturally, all rules about dream interpretation are paradoxical. We are sometimes pursued by powers in the unconscious, where in the dream we can only escape. It is right to escape. There are destructive tendencies in the psyche which we have to avoid. But 80% of what pursues us in dream really wants to come towards us. The shadow is not at all 100% evil. I have already mentioned that in criminals sometimes they have even noble personalities as a shadow. But even in the ordinary man in our civilization, the shadow is very often a kind of harmless brute, or the more natural man, the man without good manners, the nature person, but not at all an evil person, and even something which likable and very important to have with one. Our ego and is by our education forced to wear a lot of masks and to behave in a unnatural form, and therefore we repress all sorts of natural animal reactions and simple human reactions out of politeness and good manners and whatever the situation requires. For people to learn to know their shadow and to live their shadow a bit more, it makes them generally more accessible and more natural and more round and human altogether. People without shadow who are perfect inflict an inferiority on their surrounding and irritate their surrounding. And that's why one is so relieved if something nasty happens to them. I say, thank God he's also only human. I've noticed that analysts try to be very correct with their patients, but sometimes there's a slip-off. And I've often noticed that when I produce a real slip-off in an analytical hour and the patient can make me powerful reproaches, it improves our relationship. Because the analysants feel, after all, von Franz is only human, and now I feel above her and I'll pardon her. And that's a good feeling. And then one has a more natural human being to human being relationship. The shadow is really our best social function. It integrates us into the group. With our good qualities, we are above the group. With our shadow, we are man among men. And human all to human. And that is that's why the shadow is very often in dreams represented as something important, or which one should love or accept, or not scorn, but fully accept within oneself.
Returning to the idea of projecting the shadow, is that what lies behind the scapegoat?
It is well known from group dynamisms that it is so terribly awkward to live and to be aware of one's own shadow that if somebody else within a group, or let's say in a family, does something nasty, everybody is relieved, because now you can say, it's the other who did it. We have a proverb, the good man pays great attention if the other does also evil. So they can say, it's the other, it's not me. And that plays a great role in the so-called scapegoat psychology, and how in certain groups, and mainly also in a family, sometimes one child or one member of the family takes on the role of doing all the evil the other would like to do and don't dare to do. And then the others push that person more and more into that evil role. And probably even in the criminal in society has a similar role. He's like a negative redeemer. He redeems society from having to face its own shadow, because then they can say, it's that fellow who did the murder. I only wished to do it, but didn't dare to do it. And so if somebody has a weak personality, a weak ego, he can even succumb to suggestions and act out shadow things which other people really wish or desire. It's very difficult. In the shadow side of our personality, we are very much mixed up with the surrounding world, and it's very difficult. And therefore, it is very important to know our shadow and to keep it out of the group phenomenon. Otherwise, we weigh down our surrounding with all our unlived, nasty qualities. And that's why, for instance, in the antiquity, the old Greeks and the old Jews and many other populations had the idea of a purification of the community by choosing some people as scapegoats and sacrificing them or driving them out into the desert. And they take all the sins of the community with them. They carry the projection, they are the shadow, they pay for it. And then the others feel, so to speak, all right again. And perhaps some people can also remember that at a party, as they say, the devil suddenly got into them. And with a little bit of alcohol, they suddenly misbehave terribly. And the next morning when they wake up, they can't understand how they did all these things and said all these things they said. That is generally not only a breakthrough of their own shadow, but of the group shadow. The evil they acted out not only their own evil, but the evil of all other people as well.
Would you talk about Nazi Germany in that regard?
They projected mainly the shadow onto the Jews. That was the scapegoat. And they called the Jews, they accused the Jews mainly of being greedy for money, sensuously seducing and defiling all their women, and striving for world power. Now, the Nazis clearly strove for world power. Money was their aim number one. Even if a Jew gave a lot of money, then he was elected to be not a Jew. With money, they threw over all their principles, and they defiled their own women by turning them into cows who had to produce soldiers. No recognition of the woman as a human being in Nazism at all. So you can say all these things which they mainly accused the Jews were just what they were doing. Or for instance, at the beginning of the war, Hitler said of Churchill, that criminal who pulls one little country of Europe after the other and into his powers and ruins it. Tableau, who did that?
Could you tell me a dream which reveals the creative side of the shadow?
I remember a man who had a great gift in writing and who should have written his thesis for the Jung Institute. And he had always dreams that powerful animals pursued him, and I interpreted that his creativity wanted to reach him, but he didn't accept it. He always said it was sexuality. Now, actually, he had a woman friend and had very satisfactory and lots of sex, and therefore I didn't believe his interpretation. But he didn't want and couldn't write till he dreamt that he was pursued by a bull, and he ran, and the bull was after him, coming closer and closer, and in the last minute he jumped over a fence And the bull stood still and went onto his hind legs, and he looked back and saw the erected piece of the bull, and it was a ballpoint. So I said, now there you are. After that, he wrote an excellent thesis.